Yet today, from Luke chapter 4, just a little bit. We won't read the whole narrative. But to remind us about part of what we're doing today. What's at the heart of what we're doing today. Luke 4:14. Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and news about him spread across the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been raised. On the Sabbath, he went to the synagogue as he normally did and stood up to read. The synagogue assistant gave him the scroll from the prophet Isaiah. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written. And if you know it at this point, feel free to say it with me. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners, and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the synagogue assistant, and sat down. Every eye in the synagogue was fixed on him. He began to explain to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled, just as you heard it." This is the word of the Lord, and we give thanks to God. I'm going to take a moment to find a windscreen for my microphone. Probably not annoying anyone else, but it's annoying me. So just give me 1 sec. Much better. See, I can blow into it now, and you can only barely hear it. The things you learn as a pastor, you didn't think you'd learn about. Well, good morning again. Today we're continuing on from last month. For those of you who weren't here, we took a dive into mostly the New Testament. We looked a little bit at the Old Testament, and just noted the very many, once you sit down and look at it, the very many passages, stories, narratives that refer to incarceration or imprisonment or penal system, anything like that. We looked at everything from, of course, the disciples in Acts, which actually, when you actually sit down and list them out, there are like a dozen times that apostles or others are in prison in Acts. Anything from that to Jesus himself spending at least one night there in jail, and many, many other. We're not going to recount them all. You should have been here. It was incredible last month. And then we looked at some of Paul's writings and Hebrews there, which actually is the one I thought I'd begin with today. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 3, kind of in the midst of a list of things, right? A list of responsibilities that the writer of Hebrews is calling out to the church. In the midst of it, it says, "Remember prisoners as if you were in prison with them." And one of the things I concluded last month is that as much as some have tried, and as much as we perhaps would like to because it's easier, we are not called here to certain prisoners. Some have interpreted in Hebrews that, well, he must be talking, or she must be talking about Christians in prison. And that's something we read into the text. Maybe that's true. We don't know that for sure. So my conclusion is we're talking about those who are imprisoned. The implication there sometimes is, a scholar will say, well, so we're talking about those who are innocent in prison. Well, that may be, but the guy to Jesus' left was not innocent, and he liberated him then and there. So, remember prisoners as if you were in prison with them. Two preludes, I guess, before we really get into it. One is, I wanted to recommend this book again, because I had forgotten the slide last time. And I haven't read it yet, but it comes on great recommendation from a couple of good friends at least. You're Only Human, how your limits reflect God's design and why that's good news. And the reason I bring this book up before I say anything else again this morning is that I'm going to pound you with statistics, and I think you're responsible for them. I think we are responsible for these statistics in certain ways. Just like I think we're responsible for those who are unhoused, just like I think we're responsible for those who are struggling with addiction, just like I think we're responsible for those who are hungry and thirsty and naked and all the different things. But I also want to say that God created us with certain capacities, and we can't possibly give 100% of ourselves to any one of these given things. But part of what we're doing here as we go through these different marginalized and suffering people is become aware that we might listen for how God would want us to be involved in any given situation. But I do want to say from the beginning, yes, it's overwhelming. It is, and it should be overwhelming. It's terrible what we're about to look at. But let this not be an excuse, but know and listen for the Spirit to speak to you in terms of how we perhaps, are to be responding to these things. If nothing else this morning, we're going to be informed that we might begin to pray and ask. So, I don't know if anyone I'd love a book report from someone I know close to me, so if someone wants to read that and get back to me, that'd be wonderful. But that's basically the thesis of the book is God created us with certain capacity, and we should live into it. I do want to read this prayer. I think I skipped it last time because we read our own church's prayer on the cards we passed out. But I continue to be challenged by Roshan Bush's prayer for the church. So let me just read this in a spirit of prayer. God, we pray for your church, which is set today amid the perplexities of a changing order and face to face with a great new task. We remember with love the nurture she gave to our spiritual life in its infancy, the tasks she set for our growing strength, the influence of the devoted hearts she gathers, the steadfast power for good she's exerted. When we compare her with all human institutions, we rejoice, for there is none like her. But when we judge her by the mind of her master, we bow in pity and contrition. Baptize her afresh in the life-giving Spirit of Jesus. Grant a new birth, though it be with the travail of repentance and humiliation. Bestow upon the church a more imperious responsiveness to duty, a swifter compassion with suffering, and an utter loyalty to the will of God. Put upon our lips the ancient gospel of the Lord. Help us to proclaim boldly the coming of the kingdom and the doom of all that resist it. Fill us with the prophet's scorn of tyranny and with a Christ-like tenderness for the heavy laden and downtrodden. Give us faith to espouse the cause of the people, and in their hands that grope after freedom and light to recognize the bleeding hands of Christ. Bid us cease from seeking our own lives, lest we should lose them. Make us valiant to give our own lives to humanity, that like our crucified Lord, we may mount by the path of the cross to a higher glory. Amen? Amen. All right. I forgot the second precursor. What was it, Herb? I'll remember it later. All right, well, let's jump into it. And I didn't plan this, but I'll receive it as good planning. Just this week, most of the numbers that you're going to see this morning were released by an initiative called the Prison Policy Initiative. They just came out. They come out with a study every year, but their study just came out on Monday, and so most of these numbers are very up to date. And I'll just give you a general word that these numbers are down, but I'll say why that is both significant and yet not quite what we need yet. They're down because of the pandemic, and I'll say more about that a little bit later. So confinement systems, we're talking about a number of different ways that people are incarcerated this morning. And so in general, it's about 1.9 million now. It has been over 2 million, but right now it's about 1.9 million people are in these various confinement systems. 1,500 or so state prisons, 102 federal prisons, almost 3,000 local jails, 1,500 juvenile correctional facilities, 186 immigration detention facilities, and then there are a spattering of other ways that people are also confined against their will. Other territorial, including our territories, Guam and Puerto Rico, and I shouldn't start listing them because I won't get them all. And also psychiatric facilities are included, people not at their will confined. I'll talk in a minute. This is the U.S. I'll talk in a minute about some of the differences between some of these that I've only learned in the last couple of years, just didn't know the difference between a prison and a jail. Probably the most staggering numbers on the slide you'll see this morning. And you're probably familiar with this by now if you've watched the documentaries or paid attention at all, that the United States by far, by any way of measuring it, incarcerates more of the nation's citizens than any other nation by far, any way you want to measure it. So let's start this morning just in terms of total prison population. So these are, I almost said bodies, these are people. Men, women, young people incarcerated. So this number is a little bit old, but to get the chart, I have to go with it. But over 2 million it was 2 years ago, a little bit under that now. The next highest is China, which, you might expect, not because of their government, because there's a lot of people in China. I don't know if you've heard, 1.4 billion people. And then you can look at I'm not going to read the whole list there. But when you compare the numbers to the total population on the right column, it's staggering just how, by rate of population, and I'll show you the numbers on the next slide, our brothers and sisters in the United States are behind bars or behind glass, really, quite a few of them today. These numbers make sense. I don't mean do they make sense, don't make sense, but by the way, many of you don't know, I was a math major in my undergrad, so I just love to be able to use the little bit of math skills that I have sometimes as a pastor, because it doesn't come out very often, so this is part of why we look at statistics. But are there any questions about this, or was this new to anyone?
Percentages would help.
Yes, well, it won't quite be percentage, it's about 0.06%, but let's look at we'll talk about per 100,000 residents, okay? And so per 100,000 residents, for every 100,000 residents, there are 629 people in the United States in prison. The next highest, and these countries weren't even on the other chart for the most part, but these are the next highest rates of incarceration, Rwanda, Turkmenistan, and you can read the rest of the list. So no matter which way we try and slice the numbers, we are very good at putting people behind bars in this nation. So that leads to a lot of questions, right? Are we a more criminal people? Is our law stricter? Why? What? And we don't have all the answers this morning, but this is the question we have to begin to ask. I mean, if we see these numbers, and no one disputes these numbers whatsoever, why? I'm not looking, I mean, if somebody wants to say something, you're welcome to, but we're not trying to solve this at the moment in particular, although we'll talk about some reasons in a minute. That's the question for us as a people who are called by our Lord and Savior to remember the prisoners as if we were in prison with them, and to liberate the prisoners as Jesus called and did himself. I'll give you a link to this full report that you can look at later, and I do encourage you to, because it's much more developed than I could possibly go into this morning. But just a couple of snippets that kind of speak to the situation. So if you want the percentage, Dorothy, 25% of the total prison population. So if we count every single person who's in prison, incarcerated in the whole world, 25% of the population, incarcerated population, are U.S. citizens in the United States or territories. I had done the math a few weeks ago, but I forget at the moment what percentage our population, I think, are we 6% of the world? I think it's around there. No such statistician. I believe our population as a whole, in the total world population, is about 6%. So if we have 6% of the world's population as a whole, we have 25% of the world's prison population. In 1972, if I did my math correctly, it's 50 years ago, our prison population was 200,000. So is that half a century? Yeah, in that half a century, it was 10% in 1972 of what it is today. Again, the question must be, why? Did we become more criminal since 1972? All right, you're not going to be able to see all this, and it is in the report, but it is, I did want to put it up here because it's very important and notable to see how and why people are imprisoned. So I'm actually going to sit next to the computer so I can see it for a moment. Hope that's okay, Malcolm. First off, the big, almost, or a little more than half, I should say, section of the pie are people in state prisons. So let me just talk for a minute about the difference between prison and jail. In the last couple of years, as I've dug in more deeply, I just did not use those words interchangeably. Someone's in jail, they're in prison. For the most part, those who are in jail are either awaiting their trial for whatever they're being convicted of, or they're serving out a shorter sentence where it just makes sense for them to stay in the local jail, like a year or something like that. And if you really wanted to drill down later on, you could see all the smaller. So this is the orange, kind of a little more than a quarter there on the upper right. So, for instance, 141,000 of those in local jails are in for violent crimes, 110,000 or so for property crimes, 110 or so for drug crimes, and so on and so forth. But they're usually waiting trial. And let me bring it home. So I continue to be thankful to Shanir Bennett for allowing me to share his story, a kid who grew up for several years in our church and a few years ago was in the wrong place at the wrong time, made some bad choices. We all make bad choices, and he, as a teenager, was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and was arrested for some pretty terrible crimes, and sat in jail for 9 months awaiting his trial, and while he was on trial. And many of you knew Karen, his mother, when they came to our church, and she died while he was in jail. So he hadn't been convicted of anything yet. Couldn't go to his mother's funeral, couldn't talk to her in her final days. There were many reasons for that, but ultimately, and I still say incredibly, he was found not guilty. He just had so many things against him as a young, at this point, basically unhoused young black man, but thankfully he had a good public defender, and he was found innocent and was released, but not before he spent 9 months of time in jail, missed his mother's funeral, and all of that. That's just one. That's just one of many, many stories. And of course, many of those people in there are, going to be convicted rightfully according to U.S. law for their crimes. But a big difference between our system, one of the reasons, if you want to answer the question why, a big difference between our system and many other systems in incarceration in other nations is the bail system. Are you familiar with how bail works? And so it's said to be a deterrent that people who might have committed this crime shouldn't be out there in case they might run, in case they might do it again. But if you can afford the bail that a judge sets for you, you can be free. Under certain, often the times there are restrictions, right? Whether it's you have to report to an officer or even maybe have to wear an ankle bracelet or something like that. But for the vast majority of people, they can't afford that bail. And it's the only thing in that time that they're waiting. Money, lack of money, is the only thing that keeps them from having freedom during their time awaiting trial. Most other nations have gone to different kinds of systems. Really, it's us in the Philippines that are left in terms of the way the cash bail system particularly works. So jail is a place where you're generally awaiting your trial, or you're just serving out a shorter sentence than going to prison. Once you have been convicted, that's when you would enter a prison. And prison is longer term. This is where people go once, there always can be appeals or whatever else, but once a case has been decided, an individual would go into prison. Now, Pastor Kurt's in Boston today, but if he were here, I might have asked him to share some of his experience differentiating between the two. And ultimately, now the books and the podcasts and the formerly incarcerated people I've listened to, jail is actually a lot worse than prison. Prison tends to be a place where there are more, let's not call it, Disneyland or anything, but there are more services. And actually, the last several years, now that these numbers have been out for about a decade now, people have started to notice more and more. Things are changing, very slowly, but little by little. And there do tend to be more services in education and college and GEDs and college degrees and jobs and other sorts of things for those in prison. But in jail, it's a madhouse. You're just there waiting. Who knows how many people you're in a cell with, what kind of people you're in a cell with. You have less access to family and vice versa in jail. And it's just the stories that I'll share the podcast again with you later that you could and should listen to are heartbreaking of the experience that people have while they're in jail. So I'm not going to go through this whole, there's obviously a lot there you could and should look at later on in terms of why people are in a certain facility and the percentage of who is, what they did and why they might be there. Okay, Massachusetts. Massachusetts has about a third of the rate that the nation has. So the nation was about 629 people per 100,000 residents. Massachusetts was like 200 something. It's not on this slide. Anyway, it's like 240 or something like that. But still a high rate, higher than any of the other major democracies of the world. Massachusetts has a higher rate than most any of them. So about 10,000 in local jails in this state, in this commonwealth, if you must. About 9,000 in state prisons, and then federal prisons, about 2,000. All right, I said I'd talk about the pandemic. Excuse me. And this, again, is from the Prison Policy Initiative, paraphrased a bit, but what happened to prison and jail populations during the pandemic? In the first year of the pandemic, there were significant reductions in prison jail populations. Prisons dropping by about 15% in 2020, and jail populations by about 25% by the summer of 2020. Maybe you remember some of this. Some of this was in the media, right? Just people saying, hey, it's time. It's time for some of those who are awaiting trial for certain things, particularly low-level drug convictions. It's time. It's ridiculous that they're in there, and there was some relenting there. But listen to how they present these. These are the kinds of year-over-year changes needed to actually end mass incarceration. Unfortunately, the changes that led to such dramatic population drops were largely the result of pandemic-related slowdowns in the criminal legal system. So all of us slowed down during the pandemic, right? None of us were going to work, doing our normal day. So, well, that was true of the court system. And so they're just, I'll use this terminology, the pump wasn't on at the time. And so not nearly as many people were going in, while some were still coming up on the end of their terms and were released. These are not permanent policy changes. And as the criminal legal system has returned to quote-unquote business as usual, prison and jail populations have already begun to rebound to pre-pandemic levels. And again, there's more you could read about that in the report. So this is a term that's actually a little bit newer to me, at least the term itself, but not the idea. So jail churn is something that I wanted to highlight. So jail churn, I just used the word pump. The pump wasn't on. Jail churn. In a typical year, about 600,000 people enter the gates of a prison, but people go to jail over 10 million times each year. Now you understand that there are individuals in that number that are going multiple times, but this is the number of times that someone enters into the system. This jail churn is particularly high because most people in jails have not been convicted, as I said earlier. Some have just been arrested and will make bail within hours or days, while many others are too poor to make bail and remain behind bars until their trial. A smaller number of people in jail have actually been convicted, about 103,000 on any given day. This is nationally. At least 1 in 4 people who go to jail will be arrested again within the same year, often those dealing with poverty, mental illness, and substance use disorders, whose problems only worsen, of course, with incarceration. And this is one of the places I feel like the church can enter into pretty quickly. This is so when we do compassionate work, when we get to learn the stories of people in our, I almost said in our neighborhoods. That just isn't true for us, is it, for the most part? There's some here in our neighborhoods, but the rest of us, we live a rather white picket fenced life. But we can go beyond them, and that's what I'm saying at this point. The more we understand these other situations of poverty and mental illness, and in great part for us in our church, right, substance use disorder, the more we understand that by removing barriers in people's lives to life and to freedom in general helps reduce the numbers that we're just looking at. Now, for us, it's not nearly as much about the numbers as it is the people who are behind the numbers. But as we think about what Jesus has called us to do in terms of liberating those who both are impressed and those who are in prison, well, a significant way we can do that is by helping people get out of the system in the first place. This is part of what Kurt and them are doing this very moment on the streets of Boston. Just trying to help people who literally have sold their phone for cash, even call home or to a spouse or to somebody that might help get them on the path, away from the things they feel like they have to do in order to survive. And many of you are already doing this, and so I want to give you this encouragement as social workers, or as teachers, or as friends of the homeless, or certainly our work in and through the Anchor. We're already doing this in certain ways, but there's so much more, of course, we could and should be doing as well. I've got a little bit more, but I just want to pause here and see if there are any questions or comments or laments or...
Yeah, Jeremy.
Yes, sir.
You talked about the reduction in numbers during the pandemic because of people being released. And I'm wondering if there are any statistics or even anecdotes on what happened to those people as well. So there's a reduction in incarceration, but also they were released into a lockdown, essentially.
Yeah, I don't know. You've heard and I've talked about the numbers, particularly when it comes to substance use, that for a lot of them, just services haven't been about substance use right now, because that's what I know about through the Anchor. We know that because that people were just left alone and they didn't have the lifelines they needed, whether it's recovery meetings or whether it's medical appointments or whatever else the supports are. Many have perished one way or another. Again, I'm just talking about substance use. I can't, and the same would be true, particularly with mental illness and certainly, of course, poverty, but I don't know specifically.
And that's an important question.
Say again?
That's an important what happened to them, because you only have to have, anecdotally, one person that got released. 100 may have gotten released and moved back to programs and gotten back into the community, and one person gets released who recommits a heinous crime, and we go the wrong way.
Yeah, it's a cycle. It's a churn, the system. And this is why, and I don't even know how much you guys knew about this, but this is why they weren't banging on the doors in March of 2020, but when they said, we're having our meeting, government restrictions be gone. I struggled with that because here, I'm trying to render unto Caesar, but also people really need to go to their meetings. I don't think unless you have participated in recovery meetings, you understand the lifeline that it is for people. I continue to encourage you. Talk to me first because we don't want to overwhelm numbers, but just to listen to the strength and wisdom that's in that group, and that wasn't happening in so many places. And so I did talk to the board, but we said, yes, you may continue to meet. We did it outside, and they had to wear warm stuff, and that's how the new meeting actually started. We didn't have that meeting prior to COVID, and it began, and there were 27, including myself, there this week. So a lot of things have rebounded. A lot of services have rebounded, but there's so much more. Others?
I wish that we could somehow grasp that those figures are not a long ways away from us. They certainly, we are meeting individuals that
So for those in the live stream, Pastor Dennis was just saying how close these situations actually are to us. And this is no Chateau d'If, right? This is not like islands out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I guess we've had a couple of those in this nation, but things I was going to do for this presentation was show you geographically right around us. So we've got Plymouth County, just right off Exit 5 of Route 3. We've got Suffolk County, right downtown in Boston. But part of the design of the system is that we don't know about it. And it's part of, and like literally part of the design, but it's also even more so part of the design. I don't know what I'm trying to say here. Like, obviously when you're in prison, you're isolated from it's like the design of prison. But it's even more so by, I can't tell you how difficult it is to get inside as a family member, as a clergy person. I think I shared last month just how frustrated I was. Like, I'm 6'1" white guy who's got more privilege than me walking into Plymouth County Jail to visit Chenier, and I was blown away by what I had to do. And just because of my privilege, I didn't, know. But now that I've listened all the more to spouses, particularly women, and children, and just how the things they have to go through, they are, the way they say is, I am also incarcerated. I am also in prison with my loved one. Whether it's the strip searches or and during the pandemic, forget about it. For so many people, you couldn't get in or get any news. I'll show some of these numbers actually in a minute in terms of families and the reverberations of incarceration. I just took like 5 side trails and trying to get close to us. Yeah, just being able to know that these are neighbors, I'm not going to ask this morning for people to put up their hands, but you might be surprised, whether it's themselves or a loved one. There's something I'm missing. Well, I guess that's the 2 things. What else would it be? Anyway, one way or another impacted by the system. They have a bunch of myths in this report that they want to debunk, and I was very surprised by some of them, actually. One of the things I will say as, when I started jumping into this stuff a couple years ago, and I think I've shared with you the stories as to why I did that, but I got really into it, and Twitter and all of that kind of stuff, and there are some talking points amongst certain segments of the political field, I'll say for now, that it made sense to me at first, because you can tell a certain narrative and make it seem like the whole narrative is like that microcosm. We all do this. But some of the myths that they debunk by actual numbers, were actually interesting. And their whole initiative, of course, they want to reduce prison population, but they want to do it like with the actual policy. They understand, that's why they put policy in their names. They understand that in the end it's going to be policy change and budget change that actually leads to change. But I'll just show 2 of them. And this is one of them that surprised me. Because you hear a lot about private prisons. Private prisons are the corrupt heart of mass incarceration. Well, they exist. They absolutely exist. So a private prison means it's not funded by, well, I shouldn't say that. It's a for-profit system. And money is being made by these prisons. So the government basically feels like, well, we can't handle the sheer volume of prisoners, and so they pay. That's why you can't say it's not public money, because it is. They pay for incarceration through private companies who just build jails and house people. So it does happen. However, I was surprised by this. It's only about 8% of the total U.S. prison population. And yet, because our numbers are so big, it's still 150,000 people. And there are only, as you saw earlier, only a few nations that even have more than that. So there's still a lot of people, but it is only about 8%. And then the second one, crime victims. So people who are the recipients who've been acted upon by crime support long prison sentences. And they had a survey. I was going to say, I forget who, you could look at the report, who did the survey, because it wasn't Prison Policy Initiative, but I just don't remember at the moment. And they found a number of things. 20% of crime victims prefer longer sentences, so certainly that is true. But 61% prefer shorter sentences and more spent on prevention and rehabilitation services. I would like to see this. I'm just thinking about this. I would like to see if that's actually higher than those who haven't been a victim of crime. I don't know. Maybe that's wishful, hopeful thinking, but it seems to me that you think more about victims of all sorts when you've been the victim. I don't know. I'm posturing there. Only 14% of those who've been the recipient of a crime prefer money invested in prisons and jails, while 82% prefer investing in, that should say at risk, of course, at-risk youth and other prevention programs. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
What is the percentage of blacks and minorities and poor people
Yeah.
compared to the rest of the population of prison?
Thank you. When I finished this presentation this morning, I was like, I know someone's going to bring up race because it needs to be brought up. I don't have specific numbers at the moment, but much higher rates because of the way the system works for minorities in prison. To answer your question, as a higher rate, I mean, someone could look it up right now. I just don't want to tell you numbers that I don't actually know at the moment. And I've said recently, I've shared with you guys that I've volunteered with in the past a group called Black and Pink. Anyone heard of Black and Pink? They, as many prison organizations do, I wasn't going to say ministry, but it's not a Christian organization. Nonetheless, they write letters, and they respond to letters, but particularly for LGBTQ plus prison population. And they posit, and they had made a good case, that the most marginalized person in this nation is the black trans woman who's incarcerated. And the stories that they shared, I took an E&C class with me a couple of years ago. All we did was sort letters. We didn't even get to writing because they had stacks and stacks of. We were organizing letters that were written 3 years before we got to them in the pile, and just to tell you the sheer volume of them. So yes, and that should be a further aspect of it all, of the whole presentation. Much higher rates for those who are minorities. You got something, Mom?
In 2018, Black Americans represented 33% of the sentenced prison population, nearly triple their 12% share of the adult population. Whites accounted for 30% of prisoners, about half of their 63% share of the adult populations. Hispanics accounted for 23% of inmates compared with 16% of the adult population.
One of the many things, I don't think I've shared this story, I'm going to keep names out of it. One of the many things that started me thinking about this many years ago is I was in court to be present with somebody who was facing, I don't think conviction is the right word. They were in trouble, I should say it that way, for drug-related crimes in court. And this individual came from a well-established, I should say, family in a local community. And I just watched him breeze through that court like it was nothing. I didn't say he was white, a well-established white family in a local community. And I was so thankful. That's why I was there, was to support him and to pray with him and hope it all went well, and it did, and he walked out of the courthouse that day. And then a couple years later, when Chenier was in for something else, Chenier's black, I didn't know this, I still don't know the system. And he just told me, yeah, my court date is this date. And so I showed up at 8 a.m. And as it was, I stayed there all day. And he actually was in front of the judge for maybe 7 seconds. But I watched, and I could see the disparity as they just ushered people in and out between just the way people were handled. It could only be by the color of their skin, the difference. And certainly that means resources and everything else that often comes with that. So it's certainly a major factor, the disparity of resources and ability to work through the system as it is. I don't think I finished the last one here, right? 19% of people, again, this is people who've been the victims of crime, think prison helps rehabilitate people. And 52% think prison makes people more likely to commit crimes. One of the things, and I think I talked about this a little bit last month, one of the things that I've learned as I've listened to people who've actually been incarcerated and families and such, and not just, Shawshank and The Green Mile, what are some of the other big prison movies? I just mentioned, what's Chateau d'If from? Count of Monte Cristo, which of course, is much older, but Les Mis, yeah, all these different, and there are some truths there, and actually one of the ones I'm going to mention here is the idea of institutionalization, which Shawshank really, I was really a big Shawshank fan. I don't know if people like that movie, but the idea that they present in that movie about institutionalization and what it does to the human person, changing the human person, being in there for certain amounts of time, is absolutely true. I mean, we are, in great part, the product of our environments. And you treat people like animals, and they're going to act like that at different points. Although I have been helped quite a bit by listening, again, to both people who are formerly incarcerated, and a couple of these podcasts are able to actually get in and interview people who are currently incarcerated, how that system actually works and what it is that changes the soul. Certainly those who are incarcerated with you, but even more so those who have the authority over you in prison, in jail. All right. Oh yes, I said I'd mention this. So mass incarceration and its impact on others who aren't incarcerated but are one way or another connected to those who are. So we already saw 1.9 million in the nation are incarcerated in prisons or in jail, or those other smaller numbers we talked about territorially and psychiatric and such. But in addition to that, there are almost 5 million people in the country who are formerly incarcerated. So those who've been in one way or another and are now out. Add to that all those who are still, these people who are alive, not, of course, who are still living citizens, who have ever been convicted of a felony, almost 20 million. And then the one that's really gotten my heart, oh no, that's the next one, sorry. Have a criminal record, people in the nation have a criminal record, almost 80 million. And then the one that's really torn me apart recently are those family members who've never been to prison or jail for their own record. 113 million adults. I didn't see that earlier. Wow. That number's way higher when you factor in children. Why did they do that? Maybe they don't have access to that. So as Pastor Dennis said, it is very close. 113 million is, let's just say, roughly a third. Actually, it's almost exactly a third of our population at this point. All right, so. Oh, no, I do have one more stat. What was this one? Oh, yes, this is just another way of thinking about the larger picture. So again, the colored part of the graph, 1.9 people in facilities right now. But 820,000 are on parole, which is just another part of the system, a further part of the system that, restricts an individual and what they're able to do, and very often, rightly so, but still people who are in the system that need compassion. And then almost 3 million on probation. So, what do we do? Well, and I understand there are people in this room who could probably say 10 times more than I could about these numbers, and then there are some who, like me 5 years ago, just Shawshank was really my extent of what I knew. So I understand what we do, again, is going to be at different, I don't want to say levels, but in different ways, right? And again, we're not all called to prison chaplaincy or to be a part of abolition apostles I'll talk about in a minute. But we're all called to respond to what Jesus has called us to do, and that's really at the heart of so what can we do at all different kinds of levels? Well, again, become informed. I'm happy to present this stuff to you today, but I ask you to go and do more. Maybe you do know somebody who's affected one way or another, and you want to be gentle and gracious about how you approach somebody, but just say, you know what, I'm trying to learn more. I'm trying to be more informed about the situation in the state, whatever it might be that you might know, and go for a meal or something. If nothing else, read this report. The media has picked up a little bit of late. The pandemic certainly was a distraction, as it was for everything in life. But there are lots of ways to pay attention. You just have to go for it. I'll share this link in our church group on Facebook later. You can write it down quickly if you want. But this is for the whole report I've been drawing from this morning, for the most part. Get to know a prisoner. All right, well, how do I do that? It's easier than you think it is. Again, you're not just going to waltz into a facility. But there are ways. There are many organizations. I listed this one here. Abolition Apostles Church is a church in New Orleans, which is the highest incarcerated city and the highest incarcerated state, although Oklahoma was closing in fast on Louisiana. And a couple said, our church's sole mission is going to be to connect people Christians on the outside. Actually, they've gone well beyond Christians now. Anybody can sign up. Connect people on the outside, they call it, with people on the inside. And they've been doing this in the tens of thousands. In fact, they're so overwhelmed right now on both ends with people those who are incarcerated who want a pen pal, and those on the outside who they're trying to catch up with all of it. But you can look them up, sign up. You have to take a little training. They usually do it Sunday afternoons via Zoom right now because they want people to be informed about, what you're doing, what you can and can't do. And there are a lot of things you can't do. No colored pencils, my friends, if you're writing and many other things like that. But this is one way to do it. I've signed up for a few. I'm also writing with a friend who was incarcerated during the pandemic. How do you remember somebody? Like in real life, how do you remember someone? Well, you have to communicate with them and talk to them and ask questions and share your own life. And this is one way you can do it. They are doing better, though it's ridiculous how far behind we are, like decades with email. They are doing better in enabling people to use. You have to pay for it, of course, because for some reason, we all don't have to pay for email, but those in prison do, and phone. I didn't even talk about that, phone call. In fact, one of the bills recently in Massachusetts that I was very interested in was eliminating phone costs for those who are incarcerated in Massachusetts. I'm not sure where that's at the moment, but it's silly. It's really silly. Yeah, Diane?
Well, that just reminded me of another thing. But there is a ministry through the President's Church in Quincy that is one of very few in the country that prisoners write to them and request certain books.
Oh, I think I heard about that. They were asking on Facebook for books, I think, not too long ago.
And so you sign up for a time, they train you, and they have like a library in the church basement, and you go looking for the book.
Particular books, yeah.
Particular book, Tom Sawyer, and they have it. Maybe it's something a little more remote, but you can find the same author. But this is like 3 different times during the week. One of the times is Tuesday night, because I've done that before. But it's a great
Yeah.
ministry, and it's very little training, and they take all volunteers. But the other thing I thought of, this is just an aside, but when we were in Brockton, we used to, on Sunday nights, get a phone call from, I think it was Plymouth House of Correction or something, every Sunday night, and a couple of times, I would refuse the charges because it wasn't, I knew I didn't know anybody there. And then the third time I go, whoever's calling thinks he has the right number. And I felt badly. So if this ever happens to you, take the call and let them know they're calling. Because how heartbreaking is that you have your mother's number is changed or you've got a number wrong and you think she's refusing your call.
Yeah.
So, that's a stupid little thing. But
No.
it popped into my head that I just accepted it to tell them, you've got a wrong number, you have to check on this, you've been calling this number and it's
Yeah.
this.
We all joke, many of us joke about, we don't do a phone anymore. Shoot me a text, leave a message, but don't you dare call me. Well, the phone is a lifeline for people in prison still. One of the podcasts I'll share in a minute, Ear Hustle, their latest series or whatever, they're just doing 15-minute episodes. Can you afford 15 minutes of a podcast? Where they play, because that's usually the amount of time you're allotted on the phone. They play 15-minute conversations and then a little bit of follow-up with the loved one between. And sometimes it's joyful. Sometimes it's like I'm encouraged by what I hear. I'm like, man, if these people can do this, I can do whatever I think I can't do today. And sometimes, of course, it's heartbreaking. But the phone we could do a whole presentation on the phone. But I didn't realize that it was in Church of the President in Quincy. I'll have to look into that. Loretta.
When you talk about the barriers, I have a friend who had a relative out of state in prison, and she asked if people could send her books to read. So I sent some of the books I thought she'd like to send. Found out later that they wouldn't let her have them.
Yeah.
It has to come from a company, like through Amazon. So anything you just send, that she could only get when she was finally released. And even writing letters, you have to for
Yep.
how they look at the medicine.
That's why working with these organizations that have no, because it can be totally different from one facility to the next, even in the same county. And honestly, most often it's just the warden and what he, perhaps sometimes she, says. Like what they say, like this is the way it works here, and you can't. And then they can change it from month to month, and there's just a lot of authority there. And so, working with organizations like Abolition Apostles, or I don't know the name of the one at Church of the Presidents, but Prison Book Project. That sounds like a good name. They know. What's that? Okay. Yeah. I'll find that link and share that as well. But that's part of the frustration is because people don't know. And so maybe a family member gets transferred from one facility to the next, and what you were able to do, this whole system you figured out over here as their spouse, completely changes because they were transferred to another facility, and you got to go through all, and it's a lot. And often, they don't usually put prisons, off exit 5 in Plymouth. I mean, we live in New England where everything's tight together, but you live in Texas or California, these prisons are intentionally put where no one lives. And so we're talking, very often, I'll say a mother with kids, packing them up, driving 6 hours. So often, your hours are 7 to 9 a.m., so you got to rent a hotel the night before, and it becomes an expense and time and energy. And actually, there are churches who have set themselves up in those towns to minister to those who are literally waiting in queues of lines of cars at 5 a.m. to get in, and churches come through and give water and food and stuff. But it's a pittance compared to what's really going on. But I'll say, Loretta, yeah, it can be frustrating because different rules, different places. I was able to order directly from Amazon and send books to my friend who was incarcerated in Texas. But you got to know, you've got to interact with them in the first place. And even then, rules tend to change pretty quickly, especially with the pandemic lately. Again, I want to recommend this book. Vince has my copy right now. It's about halfway through, but you can order it. Rethinking Incarceration by Dominic Gilliard. He's a minister in the our Covenant Church. He's spoken many times in Quincy at High Rock. I used this for a class in ENC a few years ago. Great book. Again, many of you are familiar with Just Mercy and Brian Stevenson. Also great resources to look into. Dominic he particularly calls us evangelicals out in this book and helps us think through our own lenses about our responsibility in these regards. And then a brand new book by Aaron Griffith, God's Law and Order, the Politics of Punishment in Evangelical America. And again, I recommend this to you, but it's hard. It's hard news because his conclusion, you should read the book, but his conclusion is that it's our fault, actually, in great part, the system and the depths of the system. When I say our fault, I mean evangelicals, by the way we talk about law and order. He's a professor, I forget, anyone know? Down in Georgia somewhere. Then a couple new things I didn't share last time. Our district superintendent in upstate New York just finished, some of you were in class with Dr. Olivia, yeah. Just finished and had approved, or whatever the terminology is for y'all, accepted her dissertation, The Prison is Our Parish, a historical, theological, and praxis-based exploration of the prison in the United States from a Wesleyan holiness perspective. She sent it to me. She said I couldn't distribute it yet because I don't know how that works. You have to where are my local? Yeah, it has to be bound or something first. I don't know. She said don't send it out yet, but maybe I shouldn't have said with NCS faculty here that she sent it to me. But anyway, what I'm really encouraged about is seeing church leaders with some authority and voice, particularly Olivia, who's been doing this for years, actually at this point. It's part of her ministry, even as she continues as a district superintendent. Oh, what would it be like? I gotta be careful. Are we live streaming still? Okay, I don't care. What it would be like? What would it be like if those in our highest offices were relieved in great part from administrative duties to be able to walk down the street arm in arm, to preach about, not just general holiness, but here's what holiness looks like. Like Jesus' political platform there in Luke 4. I'll stop there. That would be really cool. And thanks to Reverend Dr. Metcalf for doing some of that as a DS. Again, I keep saying I'd share these with you because these really have been, for me, you know, I love narrative. I live in narrative, and podcasts offer narrative. And these all give stories. Incarceration Nation, let me name them first. Sorry, Ear Hustle, Incarceration Nation, and Prison Counts. Those are three different ones. Incarceration Nation does more so policy stuff. He does interview people in the system, even COs and correctional officers and judges. And he had an incredible interview with a former California judge, whose name I should remember. But she was the first black female federal judge in California. She's retired now, but incredible. In fact, she retired because she didn't want to be part of the system anymore. You need to listen to the interview. But anyway, Ear Hustle is all stories. Their stuff from the beginning. I've said a lot of words today, so I'm losing them. Their shtick? No. Their thing is they're two co-hosts, and one co-host is on the outside, one co-host was on the inside. They wanted everything to be equal, so to speak. Well, about a year ago, the co-host on the inside was granted, not pardon, what's the other word? Clemency, thank you, by, what's your governor's name in California? Yeah, Gavin Newsom. So they're working on getting another one inside, but great just stories. They really dig in. They'll even just do like, what's it like to walk into a cafeteria in prison? Like, what's that like? Because some things they said, I was like, oh my goodness, I never would have, like how valuable a spork is, right? Like we all make fun of sport. You know, a spork, is that still a thing for people? A spork? I see a lot of blank stares. It's a combination spoon fork. Anyway, how valuable that is for people because, you go to Panera and there's just a stack of them, but they're not. It's not like that in prison. So anyway, just incredible stories to help you understand a little bit more about what's going on. And Prison Counts is kind of a newer one, and it's co-hosted by two formerly incarcerated individuals. One of them was innocent. In fact, his story was very famous. Ryan Ferguson, some of you may know, he was just on The Amazing Race, actually. But I have loved their storytelling. I think I shared last month about him in hospice. Did I share that in here? Okay, I did? There are enough of you who weren't here. So the other guy, Dave is his name, was in, he says rightfully so, but he found himself, and I think he was in for like 25 years. And one of the stories he told it wrecked me because it was like exactly what Jesus says here. And he's not a Christian, I know, though he talks about God a lot, so maybe he is, but he had signed up to do hospice care. So he was incarcerated. And of course, when people are incarcerated, LWOP, or they're not going to leave, life without parole, lots of people die in prison. Did you consider that before? And so he just signed up to just sit with people. And he was sitting with this one guy, he called him Mr. Rodriguez. And the whole time, he was there for a couple hours. The guy didn't say a word because he was very close to death, and he's just barely breathing. And so Dave just said, there was a TV on the wall, and he just started watching whatever baseball game was on. And he had his attention, so the gentleman, Mr. Rodriguez, is over here, he has attention watching the game. And he all of a sudden was startled because he heard him kind of cough. And some of you who've been in the room of someone who's about to die, you've heard that cough, you're familiar with that, they call it death rattle. And he was able to force out, he said, I don't know your name, but God forgives you for everything you've done for being here. And so this man who knows what his family even was, but no one else there, and then he died, I'm sorry, it's kind of crucial to the story. That was his last breath, and he died. And Dave kind of told the story nonchalantly, but I wrote to this guy, Dave. I'm the nerd who looks people up on their podcast and writes to them. And I told him, dude, I don't know what you think about God, but I'm kind of in the business, and that was as holy a moment as you'll ever have. Being with this man in prison, the only person with him in the room as he dies. He wrote back and said thanks or something. I don't remember exactly what he said. That's just one story of many that if you really want to get into it, 2 million people. That's a lot of people. 2 million people in this nation. And then I'm going to have Stephen talk to us sometime. Did you guys meet Stephen this weekend? Julian's husband? Okay. Stephen Michael, he's the executive director of Heart to Heart, which is a 40-year-old organization, I believe. It's up there, that particularly seeks to provide education, particularly peace education and conflict resolution education to those who are incarcerated, and also people of all sorts. In fact, our anchor staff is doing a training with him in a couple of weeks in May that he does, just helping people navigate through conflict, which, I mean, sometimes at the anchor we have some conflict, so we thought that might be good for us. But I will have Stephen Michael come and talk to us at some point. He's a resident of Hull now, just same building as Dick and Loretta. So there are all these different accessible things that if we just get out there and put ourselves into them, we can do. I think that's it. I don't want to, any other questions or comments, or just you have to say something, or you didn't quite get this right, Pastor Jeremy, or you didn't say enough about this, and all of that will be true. Dave.
I just want to mention that Anthony Ray will be speaking in chapel.
All right.
NSCC, on March 30th. So that was
And tell people a little bit about his story.
So he spent 30 years on death row for murder that he didn't commit, and so met Brian Stevenson, who we mentioned earlier, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, and was able to help him heal and find relief. But yeah, 30 years of his life waiting to die for something he didn't do, and so he'll be speaking in chapel.
What was the date again?
Anthony Ray Hinton.
No, the date, sorry.
March 30th.
March 30th. Okay.
He's also written a book called The Sun Does Shine, which is like my book club, that kind of thing. So you can check out his book, but you can watch chapel online if you can't join us, but you're welcome to join us in the Walton Church. And I think we're going to have a short time for like question and answer after too, so you have a chance to talk to us.
Thank you. And can you just shoot me all that so I can put it in North Street News and all that? By the way, NC Chapel's online every week. I listened to Dave preach a very fantastic sermon on Wednesday. So just a shout out for all that. Anyone else? Well, like I said, it can be overwhelming, and we're only talking about one line of Jesus' political platform here. There are other lines that we will continue to consider as well. But if nothing else, may we know that we can at least make the right conversation happen when things come up. That we can graciously correct people and say, well, actually, that's not true. It doesn't work that way. But maybe some of you are called beyond just knowing in that way to actually respond in particular ways. I'll remind you, I should leave with hope. We will leave with hope, I'll pray. But I'll remind you that this story doesn't end well with Jesus. After he announces that platform, everyone's like, really? Like, oh, that sounds pretty cool. And then remember, Jesus tells the stories from the Old Testament about, the widow in Sidon, and they all of a sudden realize that he's talking about people they don't really like in Nazareth. And that's when they attempt to throw Jesus off a cliff. Like, premature death of Jesus. So this will not always, not always go well. If you get into this stuff, you will find yourself against authorities sometimes, as Jesus himself was. But this is why we understand that true righteousness is of God and not always human systems, though we seek to make human systems as righteous as we can, but they will never, ever be equivalent with the righteousness of God. And so we chase after the righteousness of God. Father, help us in these days and in the days to come as we seek to truly know what compassion is, that it's not just sending a text with money, but though we should do that, but that to have compassion is to come alongside, to suffer with, to answer as Jesus does, must the thief bear the cross alone? So give us your heart, God, and give us the active hands of Christ as we seek to be present, just as he was and as he is, even now. And now go with us our separate ways as we go to our responsibilities of this week, things of home and of school and of work, of recreation and rest. of trial and difficulty. In all these different situations, Lord, would you keep us sweet, but also persistent, seeking the justice that you offer, all in your great love, by your Spirit and in Christ. Amen. Bless you. Thank you for being here this morning.